Welcome to Ceasefire, where civics meets civility and engagement meets empowerment. Ceasefire is hosted by former Boerne ISD trustee and owner of the Boerne Bookshop, Dale Adams, and by former Boerne City Council member and local insurance agent, Ron Cisneros. Ready, aim, ceasefire.
Good morning, Kendall County. This is Ceasefire. My name is Dale Adams.
And I'm Ron Cisneros.
And today we are talking about something interesting that probably interests everybody. And the question is, are we living on stolen land? Now, this is a discussion on property rights, and it's actually going to be in 3 parts. So we're going to cover some of this show, and then the next couple of weeks we'll cover the rest.
Yes, sir. And so obviously the title, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar. This comes from a statement that Billie Eilish made at the Grammys in February when she said, "No one is illegal on stolen land." She's arguing that our land, the United States, is stolen. And so I think we need to figure out, are we truly living on stolen land? And I think then the next question we would answer is, well, so if not, or if so, what makes a nation a nation? Or what gives a state a right to exist? And
stolen implies it belongs to somebody, and it once belonged to somebody different.
Right. Yes.
And I think that needs to be defined, because belonging to somebody, the ownership right of a piece of property has changed throughout history, and at some points it didn't exist.
Right. Yeah, and historically, since you brought up history, and I love that subject, states and nations have come into being usually through conquest, revolution, territorial expansion, or sometimes purchases, like Gadsden, Louisiana. Sometimes it's just a legal exchange. So I think the difficulty in defining statehood is, we got to talk about the legitimacy of it, right? And so in today's world, that means, we got to talk about Ukraine. Do they have a right to exist, or will they always be a Soviet vassal state, right? Or does Israel have a right to exist? Does Taiwan have a right to exist, right? And what about Australia? What about the Aboriginal Australians? So was their land stolen, right? So this gets us into all kinds of difficult and fun questions to answer.
Yeah, the interesting thing I find about the concept of ownership, we live in a society that is guided by laws and customs, and fairness and openness. Mm-hmm. But that's all backed up by something that we don't really think about, which is force. Every system is backed up by force. And like you just mentioned, that countries used to change based on conquest and revolution and all this other kind of stuff. That's when it's open in the raw power. Today, we don't see that. And so we don't think about that so much. But you need to recognize that ownership rights are based on the government saying, okay, we will allow ownership rights in our country, and we will enforce that by force of violence. And so there's violence behind power. Mm-hmm. And to sum up, I think it's basically we need to recognize that it takes force to maintain rights. Mm-hmm. It can be a warlord, it can be a republic. But either way, there's force behind every right.
I would agree with that. I would add to that, or maybe sort of bring it down to self-determination. There is a point where people decide, we are a nation, we are a state, or we are going to become a state, right? And so there's this will to recognize yourself as part of this larger body or this legal entity. In fact, speaking of legal entities, this goes beyond legal recognition, which is something entirely different. This is this, I don't really care if the UN sees me as a nation. I'm going to become a nation, right? And I will eventually earn that recognition through force. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think that really is the first aspect of property ownership, is self-determination.
I think you're right in your concept about people coming together to form a government or a society or a nation. That's where historically the first property rights started to percolate up, was when we transitioned from a nomadic lifestyle to a settled lifestyle with agriculture. Mm-hmm. And then the farms were worked by people, but then who decided how they were worked and who got to work on them? And that's where ownership as a concept first came into humans. And initially, they were owned by the king or the gods or religion or some group, and individuals didn't own the land. They worked it, but the ownership was held by some greater power who had the force, honestly.
Right. And then if people didn't like that greater power, they would revolt.
Right. So transitions always involve violence,
right,
which we don't have now.
No.
Now we transition our property through deeds and cash and gifts.
Right.
But it used to always be through takings.
And I think you hinted at this a few minutes ago. So we've got this legal aspect now. We've got titles and deeds and all that. But underlying all of that, there's that threat of force.
Yes.
Right? If you don't recognize it, then I will take it back or take it by force.
Right.
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 So, and that all comes back down to that self-determination. We are going to decide that we own something. We want peace, so we'll seek out the legal remedy for it.
Right.
But if we don't get it, then ultimately we resort back to force to get it.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Good way to put it. So basically, property rights are a political construction.
Yes.
That has come about because of our political groupings.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have a political grouping, can you have property rights?
Only through force. So a little history here. In 1933, 19 nations, mostly of the American continents, came together in a town called Montevideo, Uruguay, and they drew up what was probably the first internationally recognized idea of statehood. And basically in that, they said that the legal framework for statehood would include a defined territory, a permanent population, a functioning government, and the ability to conduct relations with other states. And that has become the benchmark internationally for what constitutes a state. So recognition is a big part of that. So I'm going to go to Taiwan for a second. Taiwan meets all of those parameters except for the recognition. Many states who don't want to run afoul of China will not recognize Taiwan as an official nation. Right. And this is problematic for them because in this sort of new era where legal recognition kind of prevails, that inability to get recognized kind of keeps them as a secondary state.
Yeah.
Eventually, push is going to come to shove.
Yeah.
And they'll probably have to fight. So it takes us back to our earliest point.
Yeah.
You know, you will eventually have to fight to retain that right. And this might upset some people, but this means then that there truly is no stolen land. It's conquered land or purchased land, but nothing truly belongs to anyone. You're just a temporary placeholder for it, so long as you can continue to fight for it.
Right. Outside the context of the political structure, there isn't any ownership. And so you can't steal something that doesn't belong to you, that doesn't belong to somebody else.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting that our society comes up with these concepts in order to make things work. And then generations later, we sort of think, oh, well, that's just the way it is. Everybody nowadays in the States anyway sort of thinks, well, this property is mine and that property is yours, and I'm not going to take your property. I'm not going to put my fence post on your property. You know, if I do, I'll take it down. That's really not the way it's always been.
No.
You know?
No, and when we look at the history of ownership, so setting aside the political and the legal aspect of it, just the historical aspect of it, you know, the conquest, the revolution, and all that, if you were to rely solely on history, even that will mess you up. Like if you look at the political side or the legal side of it, it takes you back to self-determination. If you look at the historical side, it'll take you back to self-determination. Because if we rely on the historical argument, well, the natives were here first, right? Well, in most cases, there was...
Pick your year.
Yeah, exactly. Which year? You know, I mean, because we can talk about American colonization, we can talk about British colonization, and then we can talk about the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire. I mean, it goes on and on and on, and it's a history of conquest, a history of, all sorts of bad things, that make us uncomfortable to talk about. If we rely on history, where do we draw the borders?
Right. You can't, because they're constantly changing.
Right.
I think one reason why people are sort of focused on that now is that the last 70 years, our borders in the world have been fairly stable. Mm-hmm. And actually that's very unnatural from a historical perspective, because they've always been in flux all the time. And I think the conference you mentioned in Uruguay might have done something to try and solidify those borders, which I think is pretty neat. I hadn't heard about that. But normally, borders have changed back and forth a lot. And this is a new concept.
Right.
This stable border thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it only works, again, so long as people are willing to recognize it. And the minute that falls apart, you go right back down to self-determination.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that unsettles a lot of people. It's a sort of a realist way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
Everybody wants prosperity, and everybody wants peace. I'm no different. But at some point, you got to be like the Beastie Boys and fight for your right to party. There's my music reference for the day.
Okay, I'm not sure where to go with that, but
but yeah, you have to fight. I'm going to go to Billie's comments for a second, because shortly after she made those comments, she got a lot of backlash in this, and I can't remember the name of the tribe whose ancestral lands included the Los Angeles area, came out and said, hey, well, you're living on our land, right? Yeah. And people started asking her, well, you're going to give your $3 million home up, right?
Yeah.
There's the problem.
Right.
And it's like, okay, thank you, Billie. You've stated the obvious, Yes, we're living on stolen land. What are you going to do about it?
Right.
Because if they want it back.
And you can go anywhere with that. I mean, in nomadic environments, I should say, various nomads go back and forth. They conquer each other. They take land from each other. And so, yes, this one tribe claims that land from one period of time. I'm sure there's another tribe that was there 100 years or 200 years before them that can say, oh, well, that's our land because you stole it from us. Mm-hmm. And so it's once again, it's a picture year thing. You can go back and forth. The ownership of the land only is relevant in the political context. And we have established a society where we recognize each other's ownership of things. Mm-hmm. They did not have that kind of society where they recognize ownership of land per se, like that. And so it's hard to say suddenly that we have to apply our ownership recognition policies or customs to somebody in a completely different society that had no recognition of ownership.
Yeah, so, and that's a great point. A lot of these indigenous tribes, they didn't have the legal framework for identifying property, but they assumed territory.
Right.
And they assumed that they had to fight to either acquire it or keep it.
Right. So they'd started that process, the civilizational process, towards a property rights society, but they hadn't gotten there yet. Yeah. And then they were defeated in the way countries were defeated. And with that, we're going to take a quick break. This is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron. We'll be right back. Boerne has its own bookshop. In fact, it's called the Boerne Bookshop. Hi, I'm Dale Adams, inviting you to get lost. Get lost in a good book in our relaxed and casual atmosphere. We have a wide and eclectic selection in the Boerne Bookshop, and we pride ourselves on finding what you're looking for. We do author meet and greets, host writing workshops, and can connect you with a good book club. And your young ones will absolutely love our kids section at the Boerne Bookshop. And while we want you to get lost, we're easy to find, as we're in the heart of Boerne at the back of the Richter Tavern building. We are the Boerne Bookshop. Welcome back to Ceasefire with Dale and Ron, and we are talking about property rights, and we've been going over a lot about how it's dependent on the political structure of a society. Mm-hmm. So what does that leave us now as far as our political structure? I hear a lot of people say, oh, well, if you're taxing my property, then it's not really my property.
Right.
And I find that interesting In a way, I can see their point, but I don't really agree because property rights have always been at the discretion of the political leadership. It used to be the kings owned it, and everybody just sort of got to use it, and that's sort of how we developed our deeds and whatnot. They started off as use documents, and now they're ownership documents. What are your thoughts on the taxation process of property?
Oh my gosh, that's a heady question. You know, I hear that argument. That this could get us into a whole other show here. I think that I understand the argument. I understand that somebody's saying, well, I don't really have full ownership because I have to pay property tax on it. But I would argue that you don't really have full ownership of anything anyway, other than your autonomy, right? Like that's it. You know the old saying, you can't take it with you.
Right.
Yeah, you were basically, when you die, you're taking your spirit with you. And so what you have in life right now is you.
Yeah.
And then you've got some stewardship of some items.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you don't really have anything else. And stewardship requires maintenance. It requires some cost, a little bit of suffering, right? And so I think property taxes are the thing. It's part of that stewardship. It's you pay because you're part of a larger group. Somebody has to pay for the streets that we drove on to get here to the studio today. Right? And we got to pay our little tithe to Boerne.
Yeah.
You know? So who owns this radio station? You know? Oh, I guess this would be a great time to do a land acknowledgement statement, which is real popular on the left today. You know,
there was once a large cedar tree right where we're sitting.
Right.
And that tree owns this spot.
That's right. Like the airwaves. Who owns the airwaves?
Well, the FCC.
The government.
Man, the government does.
Our monarch.
Yeah, they let you do it.
But only
There's
because
permission.
we legally recognize our government.
Yeah.
You know?
But that sort of brings up this concept of property rights as a bundle of rights. And so the basic ones are, can you keep people away from your property? Can you be on the property? And can you transfer the property? Those are sort of basics. But then the taxation issue, that's a little bundle. Can you keep it without paying somebody for the right to keep it without them invading you, or whatever? But then we're getting into things like digital rights, airwave rights, all these things. There's all these different aspects of property rights that are starting to bubble up now. And I think it's causing a lot of people to start rethinking property rights, sometimes from a way to try and dismantle them, because a lot of governments have done that to their detriment, but also to expand them in certain areas that before we hadn't even thought of. I mean, whoever thought of property rights of the airwaves, because they didn't even know that they existed.
Right.
But now we've got data, and now we've got all these other things, our image, our signature, all these things that we would like to own.
Yeah. And I think we've talked about this on the show a while back. We are now, because of the expanse of social media and, just technology, we're very aware now of our identity, our picture. We are very much into our privacy rights.
Yes.
Which is another type of ownership, right? Like our right to privacy, which you and I have mentioned is not really written in the Constitution. It's sort of assumed by the Supreme Court that we have that. And again, going back to self-determination, it's something that we're going to have to fight for.
Yeah.
And you see that in a lot of European nations right now, and they're sort of pushed back on Instagram and Meta, and it's like, no, people have privacy rights. Well, and I would argue so long as they're willing to fight for it.
Yeah.
And it all comes down to our willingness to fight.
Yeah.
And some people will not do that. And I can understand why. We love peace.
Right. And that's why we form our political structure, so that we can find an arrangement that people, for the most part, all agree on. That we will have these property rights or these behavioral rights or whatever.
So I was making a joke earlier about land acknowledgement statements, and if you don't know what that is, that's it's a popular movement now in bluer states where at the beginning of a meeting somebody will get up and they'll start with an acknowledgement that the land used to belong to an indigenous group, and so we're merely stewards of it, right? I hate these statements, not because I'm of the political right, but because they're meaningless. It's an empty gesture.
I would actually say it's not that empty, because in British Columbia, it has actually made it into the courts, and the Supreme Court of British Columbia has acknowledged that the tribes have certain ownership rights of land in Richmond, British Columbia. And everybody's in an uproar there, because now nobody knows whether their land's going to be taken away. And so it's actually entering the legal world, and now this is Canada, but still, things can cross borders and concepts.
And the remedy will be...
Will they fight for it?
We got to fight for it, right? And so,
it's scary.
I look at this as, for the most part, in the United States, we'll set Canada aside for a moment, it's virtue signaling.
Well, it's the 51st state, right?
Yeah. It will be soon. It depends on whether or not Greenland comes first. But so when I see those statements, what I see is somebody just saying, look at me, I'm a good person. I'm acknowledging that this indigenous tribe came before me. But what's missing is an action, right? So I'll cite, for example, several years ago, and it's probably going back a decade now, when we had the big ice bucket challenges to raise awareness for ALS. And
I never understood that.
Oh, and it led from, there was one challenge after another, and it was all to raise awareness. And I started to hate that phrase, because it's like, okay, now that you've raised awareness, how about we raise some money? Right? How about we actually do something meaningful? So all of this is just, hey, look at me, I've done something. But you've done nothing except, spit out some empty words. So what I want Billie Eilish to do, and anybody else that talks about this, is to actually take action. If you really believe that we stole something, then the moral thing to do is to return it. Right?
Yeah, well,
and then
I'm not sure I'm going to follow this road.
Well, now hang on, because if you return it, you got to figure out who you return it to. What's the statute of limitations on stolen property? Like who actually gets it, right? So let's get past the United States for a moment. Let's say we resolve that and we give everything back to the indigenous tribe that was here in Texas, right? Some other indigenous tribe might say, well, wait a second. We had it first, and they fought us for it. Maybe the Apaches fought some other tribe for it, right?
They did.
But let's say that we resolve that, and now we start working on the European continent, where we have Slavs and Finns and, all kinds of other ethnic groups, right? And we try and figure that out, like how do, start returning all of this. Where does it end?
And this is why we have a statute of limitations. Because you can't, it doesn't end. Right. It never will end.
Right.
And you've got to say, okay, when we established a system of ownership, that's when it begins.
That's right. Hence the legal frameworks.
Right.
And so we say, okay, this is the best that we can do. We can't do anything about the past. You can try, but it's a rabbit hole.
Right. You can't undo an injustice.
Yeah.
It's been done. That's history.
Yes.
And there's been tons and tons of people stealing land from each other and killing each other and all these other horrible things that they've done to each other. But you can't undo any of that.
Well, and let's just say that if we could for a minute give the land back.
But you can't, they're dead.
But let's just say that
their descendants aren't the same as them.
No, right.
By any means.
We displace some people, but to give it back to those people, then we have to displace ourselves. And then if you're a mutt like me, like
you don't get anything.
Yeah. Do I go to Mexico? Do I go to Cuba? Like, where am I supposed to go? And then I'm assuming that they'd want to take me at all, right? It's like, it's like, no, we don't want the gusano. Send them somewhere else. It's never ending.
Yeah. I think that sort of wraps up our political discussion of property rights. Next time we'll sort of talk about some other aspects. But right now I want to bring out a book. If you've got a bit of land and you want to take care of it and make it grow nicely, I've got, at the Boerne Bookshop, we've got The Texas Gardening, The Natural Way by Howard Garrett. It's a great book on gardening in Texas. It's very popular, and it helps you to take care of your land and be a good steward of your land.
Obviously, only growing indigenous fruits and vegetables, right?
Not sure what we'd eat if we did that. Okay. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you for listening. This is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron. And if you missed any of it, you can always go to BourneRadio.com and listen to the podcast or any of our other episodes. Thank you, and see you next week.